I know what you're thinking. Sam's taking over. No, it's thank you for being here today, and happy 4th of July. Really, happy 4th of July. Look, think about it. You're making history by watching history. It's our 250th anniversary. Who cares what's going on in D.C.? We're having our little anniversary right here. So let me start with opening prayer, please. Loving and liberating God, bring us to attention in spirit and truth. Move us beyond flags, fireworks, slogans, and appearances. Teach us what freedom requires. Give us the courage to serve, the discipline to grow, the humility to ask for help, and the wisdom to protect what you have entrusted to us. May our highest allegiance always be to you. Amen. St. John, Galatians gives us a mission statement for today. For all of you, it's a call to freedom. Brothers and sisters, not only your freedom is an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love to become servants of one another. And Paul doesn't waste words, does he? He tells us what freedom really is. We're not invited to admire it. We're not asked to decorate it. We're not told to celebrate only when it's convenient. We are called, all of us, to freedom. But Paul gives us a warning right away. Do not use freedom as an excuse for self-indulgence. In plain language, freedom is not permission to do what you want and call it liberty. Freedom isn't selfishness. Freedom is not entitlement. It's not passivity, and it's not waiting for someone else to carry the mission while we're all enjoying the benefit. Christian freedom has a purpose. That purpose is love. And that love becomes service. So Paul says, through love, servants to one another. Love becomes servants to one another. That may sound like a contradiction, but Paul says we're free and then tells us to serve. And that sounds like a discipline from the gospel itself. In Christ, we are not freed so that we can become arrogant, isolated, or indifferent. We are freed so that we can live more fully, serve more faithfully, and stand with those who have been wounded, rejected, forgotten, pushed aside, and told they don't belong. We're not freed from responsibility. We are freed for responsibility. Which brings us to Independence Day. This past week, our nation celebrated Independence Day as we mark our 250th anniversary of American independence. And remember that national freedom has a date, has a struggle, has a story, and it has a declaration. There was a moment when people said, we can't continue to have this as things have been. Something has to change. But today I want to ask you a more personal question. When is your Independence Day? It's not one on the calendar, not one marked by fireworks and not wrapped up in red, white, and blue. Your Independence Day. When did you stop living in fear? When did you stop waiting for someone else to carry what God was calling you to carry? When did you stop blaming others and start taking responsibility? When did you stop confusing help for helplessness? When did you stop confusing service with exhaustion? And when did you realize that freedom was not something the nation endures or declares, but something that the soul develops? Every nation has a history, and every church has a history as well. But every person in this room has a history. Some of us remember the day when we were called to grow spiritually. Some of us can remember the day when we finally asked someone for help, and some of us can remember the day we stood on our own 2 feet. Some of us can remember our first coming out stories. Some of us can remember the day that we had to say no because we were overextended. That's kind of an Independence Day too. Because independent is not only an event, it's a development. It's a discipline. It's becoming. As we celebrate Independence Day, let's not forget that a few days ago we just concluded Pride Month. That too matters. If Independence Day asks us what we think for freedom as a nation, then Pride Month asks many of us to think about what our freedom is in our own lives. Did we celebrate our own Independence Day by coming out? Did we remember to take the courage to tell others about the truth about who we really are? Did we honor those that came out in fear and silence and danger and with or without support? Did we remember those that had never been given the chance to be open and who they are? And did we make room for those who are still finding the courage to speak their truth? As we celebrate, and did we celebrate the people that were not in LGBT, but that actually helped us support every step of the way? Did we include them? Did we thank them? Because our freedom was not carried by LGBT people alone. Many of us were held up by parents, siblings, friends, coworkers, neighbors, pastors, teachers, allies, and people of faith who chose love over judgment. They stood with us when others walked away. They defended us when others condemned us. They welcomed us when others rejected us. They were reminded, and we were reminded, that we were not alone. Coming out is its own kind of Independence Day. It's a declaration that fear does not get the final word. It's a declaration that shame does not have to govern our soul. It's a declaration that God's image in us is non-negotiable. It's a declaration that we are not honoring those that stood beside us and making sure the next generation doesn't fight every battle alone. Freedom has names, it has faces, it has scars, and it has allies. Freedom has people that stood in the gap and asked nothing in return except that we be allowed to live with dignity, truth, and love. And if we want to understand a deeper revolution, then we have to look at Jesus himself. Long before the American Revolution, there was a spiritual revolution. Jesus came in the world when there was an empire, religious gatekeeping, poverty, occupation, judgment, and fear. He came into a world where it was a minority. And the power often decided what mattered, who belonged, who was clean, who was worthy, and who could stand close to God. Jesus challenged all of that. He challenged the systems that place law above love, challenged leaders that use religion to control rather than to liberate, challenged a culture that pushed people to the margins and then acted as if God placed them there above them. He ate with the rejected. He touched the untouchables, healed those others ignored, welcomed those others condemned, spoke the power of truth, taught that the greatest among us mustn't become just servants, but must become servants. That was, in his time, revolutionary. And yes, there was betrayal. There was sacrifice, judgment, disbelief, fear, suffering, and a cross. But there were also miracles. There was healing, forgiveness, restoration, and most of all, resurrection. So there's a message so powerful that 2,000 years ago, think about this for a moment, 2,000 years ago, we're still carrying it still today. And that tells me something more about true independence. True independence is not escaping hardship. True independence is becoming faithful through hardship. True independence is continuing to love, serve, forgive, and rise anyway. And St. John's has something that we all know about that. And more than 50 years ago, a few people formed St. John's Metropolitan Community Church. They didn't do it because it was easy. They didn't do it because the world was ready. They didn't do it because every door was open. They did it because they believed God's love was wider than the people that had built it. They believed that LGBT people, rejected people, wounded people, questioning people, faithful people, and searching people needed a church to call home. They believed that they had a place where people could worship without shame, a place where people could bring their whole selves before God, a place where grace was not rationed by prejudice, a place where the gospel was not used as a weapon, but proclaimed as good news. And over 50 years, there's been struggles, disagreements, losses, disappointments, seasons of uncertainty, moments when we wondered if the church would ever survive. But look around. We're still here. Amen. We're still present. We're still serving. We're still worshiping. We're still learning, still correcting, still becoming, still independent. Not because we never struggled, because we endured. Not because we ever needed help, because we kept showing up for one another. Not because we were perfect, because God was faithful. That's a miracle too. The miracle is not only that St. John's was formed, the miracle is that after all these years, the church still has breadth, purpose, calling, and people willing to serve and believe in God is not finished with us yet. For me, Independence Day is not only national, it's personal. When I enlisted in the Army back in 1984, I entered at a time where gay was not really popular. I was forbidden to serve openly, and that was the reality. There were rules, restrictions, risks, and parts of yourself that you had to guard carefully if you wanted to serve, or you risked going to prison. But I volunteered anyway. I didn't volunteer because of my sexuality. I volunteered because I believed I was qualified to do the job. I volunteered because I believed in something that I had to contribute. I volunteered because service mattered. I volunteered because duty, discipline, accountability, and the love for country was not reserved for only some people. So in a very real way, my enlistment date back in 1984 became my own Independence Day. It was not independence without limits. It was not without strict guidelines. It was not without fear, caution, or consequence, but it was still independence. Because I made a choice. I chose to step forward. I chose to serve. I chose to be true to the part of myself that I knew I was capable, prepared, and called to something bigger than my own comfort. Even in a system that did not faithfully recognize who I still knew who I was. Sometimes independence begins before the world is ready to affirm it. Sometimes independence begins before the rules are made fair. And sometimes independence begins before the doors are fully open. And sometimes independence begins when you say, I know who I am, I know what I can do, I know what I can offer, and I will not let somebody else's limitations become the measure of my calling. Freedom cannot be measured by what the world permits. Freedom must be measured by what the soul is willing to claim. I was not free to serve openly gay in 1984, but I was still free enough to serve with honor, discipline, integrity, and country. Free enough to begin becoming independent even under restrictions. And that's a part of my testimony. And not because my story is the same as everyone else's, but most of all, we all have moments where we must decide whether fear will define us or call us to move forward. For me, that began in uniform. For someone else, it may be coming out. It may be asking for help. It may be saying no for the first time. It may be beginning in a step for service for the first time in church. It may begin wherever they can find their peace, but that's also their Independence Day. Independence Day is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's cautious. And sometimes it happens under the rules we didn't write. Sometimes it happens in places we do not fully understand. But when we choose truth, responsibility, courage, and service anyway, independence begins to grow. St. John's, sometimes history has the courage of people to decide what they wish to act upon. So let me ask a few questions like a what-if situation. What if Independence Day never happened? What if no one had declared that there was a different future possible? What if everyone had simply adjusted to the injustice, accepted the distant control, and decided that freedom was too costly to pursue? Where would we be today? At what point would somebody have stood up and said, enough? At what point would somebody have become the change maker for independence? Think about also this. What if Stonewall never happened? What if those brave souls had decided that silence was more safer than resistance? What if they accepted humility as the normal? What if they had to believe the lie that they had no right to stand, no right to gather, no right to dance, no right to live openly, and no right to demand dignity? The world would be very different for us all in here today. What if Troy Perry never founded MCC? Where would we be? What if he looked at rejection, exclusion, and religion and condemnation and decided, it's easier to stay quiet? What if he believed there was no room for Christianity for LGBT people? No pulpit for the wounded, no sanctuary for those pushed out, no gospel wide enough to welcome them home? This church would be a lot different, and it might not be here. What if Paul Revere decided to take the day off when the British were coming? What if he just stayed home, deciding it's not his responsibility, someone else will do it? History would be a lot different. What if Paul, in today's lesson with Galatians, had never spoken about freedom? What if we never saw that in the Bible? Our understanding of Christian freedom would be very vastly different. The church world is shaped by people who refuse to remain silent when freedom is at stake. Independence Day reminds us that freedom has to be declared, defended, and carried forward. And Stonewall reminds us that dignity sometimes begins when people stop accepting the abuse as normal. Troy Perry reminds us that the church can be born when one faithful person refuses to believe God's love is so small as human prejudice. Paul Revere reminds us that warnings only matter when someone else has the courage to sound them. And Paul reminds us that freedom without love becomes selfishness, but freedom through love becomes service. So the question for us today is, what if we never act? What if we never speak? What if we never serve? What if we never invest? What if we never make room? What if we never make it for the next generation to take over where we're leaving off today? What if we're waiting for someone else to carry the mission? At what point in our lives do we stop admiring independence and start practicing it? At what point do we stop telling stories about change makers and become the change makers ourselves? At what point what point do we stop asking, who's going to do something? And begin saying, here I am, Lord, send me. The world would be different if somebody acted, and it'll be much different if somebody acted. Our lives are different because someone acted, but the future may be different if only we act now. Freedom is preserved by people who show up. Faith is carried by people who serve. History is changed by people who decide that silence, fear, and convenience will not have the final word. So don't underestimate your part. Don't underestimate your service. Do not underestimate what God can do through one person who says, I am willing. Because in one declaration does matter. Let me repeat that again. One declaration does matter. One night at Stonewall mattered. Our church founder, Troy Perry, mattered. One riding through the streets saying the British are coming mattered. One letter from Paul mattered. One faithful congregation, disciplined enough to protect, preserve, and promote freedom through love, still matters today. Now, let me say this plainly. Independence Day ain't easy. Through my life, I've struggled, I've asked for help, I've struggled with the feeling that I couldn't always provide the same level as others. Sometimes pride got in the way, sometimes fear got in the way, sometimes I thought independence meant carrying everything on myself and never letting anyone see that weight. But over time, I learned something. Independence is not pretending you never need help. Independence is learning how to ask for help with honesty, receive help with humility, and then grow through strong enough to ask someone for help. I learned that I could ask for help and still be responsible. I learned I can be a change maker and still need support. I could donate time, money, resources, and could show up in ways I was able to show up. And somewhere along the way, independence became less of a chore and more of a development. But I also learned another lesson. Independence is knowing when to say no. There were times when I was overtaxing time, resources, giving, and trying to be everything for everybody. That's not freedom, that's another kind of bondage. Sometimes spiritual maturity means saying yes. Yes, I will serve. Yes, I will help. Yes, I will give. And yes, I will lead. But sometimes spiritual maturity means saying no. No, I can't carry that today. No, I can't pour from an empty cup. I can't replace responsibility for personal exhaustion. I cannot let service become resentment. I cannot refuse being faithful while being overextended. And that's an important lesson for us all. Healthy independence is not selfishness. Healthy service is not burnout. God does not call us to be codependent on one another, where the same few people carry every burden while everyone else watches from the distance. God calls us to be healthier in freedom. A freedom where we ask for help when we need it. A freedom where we can offer when we can, give when we're able, build up on one another, and then where we can learn to step forward and when to step back. A freedom where we can trust that the mission belongs to all of us, not just a handful of tired people. There's a difference between healthy interdependence and unhealthy codependence. Interdependence says we support one another, encourage one another, challenge one another, serve one another, and grow together. Codependence says I cannot move unless someone else moves first. Cannot serve unless someone else gives me permission. I cannot lead until someone else carries the responsibility. I cannot grow unless someone else does the hard work for me. I cannot be held accountable because someone else always takes the blame. And that's not freedom. The dependence dressed up, that is really dependence dressed up as community. I give you, St. John's, a small peek into my life, and I do not say this for comparison, and I do not say it so anyone else can measure up their life against mine. I say it because independence is not a theory for me. It is something you have to practice. I volunteer for veterans. I serve on 3 boards with a board of directors. I work with volunteer with criminal justice organizations. I attend movie nights with friends. I watch hockey and football. I spend time with family. I go to school. I read books. I make phone calls to many of you in this congregation. I attempt to work with social media and very unsuccessful in that part. And I learn new technologies, and I also lobby in our state legislature. I'm not saying everybody should do that. What I am saying, we have to ask ourselves with our freedom of times, gifts, resources, and opportunities, what have we placed in our hands? Are we just waiting for somebody else downtown Raleigh to do all the law practicing for us? When was the last time you showed up? When was the last time you did something in your life that was truly independent? You didn't have to be qualified, just go and do it. Are you doing what God is calling you to do? Because independence is not waiting for somebody else to carry the mission. Independence is not the same as expecting people to build, repair, sustain, lead, donate, call, serve, and show up while everyone else waits for the benefit. That's not independence, that's codependence. So take a moral inventory. We're waiting for someone else to invite the younger generation, or are we willing to engage them ourselves? Are we waiting for somebody else to call the lonely when all we have to do is pick up the phone? Are we waiting for someone else to serve the community? Are we willing to be present? Are we waiting for someone else to give, or are we willing to invest? Are we waiting for someone else to lead, or willing to step forward? Are we waiting for someone else to take charge, or are we willing to become the part of change? Healthy independence says, I may not be able to do everything, but I can do something. Healthy independence says, I may need help, but I can also offer help. It also says, I may not have every answer, but I can still show up. I can grow, I can learn, I can serve, I can contribute, I can become a part of what God is building. That's not guilt, that's growth. It's not shame, it's stewardship. If we want the future generations to understand what it means to be sustainable and maintain a faithful community, we have to invest in our church. The church does not sustain itself by accident. The church does not grow by wishful thinking. The church does not remain strong because people once loved it years ago. It is sustained by people that invest in it, our time, presence, gifts, talents, resources, patience, and most of all, the willing to serve. So we invest in the church, not because we're maintaining a building or preserving a tradition. We're teaching future generations what faithfulness looks like. We're showing them what we look like. And we're showing them that freedom requires accountability. We should not take also our volunteers for granted. We also look at a volunteer army. Remember that in your history of how America was created? We should not burn them out. We should not micromanage their spirit in the drain. But yes, we need accountability. We need communication. We need expectations. We need accountability and not micromanagement. Leadership isn't control. Order is never becoming a cage that keeps people from growing. If we want mature leaders, we must help them mature. If we want faithful servants, we must form them. If we want younger people, newer members, volunteers, and emerging leaders to grow, we must give them more than just an assignment. We must give them the investment. We must give them the room. We must give them the responsibility. We must give them the support that they needed to rise. And that's how a church grows. That's how we become independent again. And that's how the mission continues. Paul gives us one more lesson. Paul worked toward the faithful goal without allowing himself to become sidelined by every competing distraction. Paul wasn't perfect. Paul had struggles. Paul definitely had opposition. He had setbacks and he had critics, but Paul understood his calling. Freedom in Christ is not an invitation to drill without purpose. It was a call to stay focused in the mission on what God has placed before him. So if that's called freedom, then we are also called into focus. Freedom without focus becomes confusion. Freedom without discipline becomes self-indulgent. Freedom without purpose becomes a distraction. And for Paul, the goal was the gospel. The goal was Christ. The goal was building communities of faith rooted in love, grace, service, and truth. And for all of us, that matters. Because if we're not careful, we can become distracted by personalities, preferences, control, conflict, and what used to be and what didn't go our way, or waiting for somebody else. But Galatians sends us back to, you were called to freedom. And that freedom is fulfilled by love and becoming servants to one another. That's the goal. Not the convenience, not comfort, not control, not personal recognition, not winning every disagreement. The goal is love expressed through service. And the goal is freedom through responsibility. Freedom is not something we honor only when the calendar tells us to do so. Freedom is not something defined that we defend only when it benefits us. Freedom is sacred. It requires discipline. It requires us to protect it, preserve it, promote it, not just once a year, not when the fireworks just light up the sky, not when patriotic music plays, and not when the crowds are watching, but every day in the choices we make, the people we serve, and the truths we tell, and the justice we seek, and the responsibilities we accept. That's the everlasting ring of freedom that does not continue by accident. But freedom is protected with discipline, preserved with courage, promoted through love, and living witnesses. That is the freedoms that Galatians has called us to. Not the freedom of self-indulgence or convenience, love, but the freedom through love, the freedom through service, and the freedom through responsibility. So as we leave this Independence Day, remember this. Independence is not something we declare as a nation, but it's something a person develops, something churches practice, something a community sustains, something faith requires. And the measure of freedom is not how loudly we celebrate it. It's the measure of freedom how faithfully we live it. Church, this is our call. This is our freedom, faith, accountability, courage to grow, a call to service, a call to love. And that call does not retire. It continues. So let us be free enough to love, free enough to serve, free enough to tell the truth, free enough to ask for help, free enough to say no with wisdom, and free enough to invest in the church, and free enough to help future generations rise, and free enough to stop telling stories about how change makers and become the change makers ourselves. Free enough to follow Christ, and free enough to remember that the highest allegiance not belongs to any earthly throne, but to God who calls us to freedom to love. If we do that, St. John's, then Independence Day will not only be something we can celebrate, but not something we just celebrated last week. It will become something we practice every day. Thank you.